I was standing at my kitchen sink, the house wrapped in the kind of quiet that feels heavier than silence, when my daughter's boyfriend walked in and said something so unexpected it made me see myself in an entirely new light, and I haven't stopped thinking about it since. Before I start, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? Are you tuning in from Phoenix, Detroit, Tampa, or somewhere more peaceful like Asheville or Poise? Drop your city so I can imagine where you are while I tell you this. If you had asked me an hour before he came in what my evening would look like, I would have given you a list of chores and small comforts. Chop an onion, simmer a pot of soup, set aside a mug for chamomile, and maybe put on some old vinyl just to hear the scratch and warmth of it. The house has been a nest of habits ever since the last pair of sneakers left the mudroom for good. My daughter Emily is 23 now, busy with grad school, a job that eats her afternoons, and a social calendar that makes my planner look antique. It's a good life, my life, full of choices I made and choices she made, but there are pockets in the day where the silence sits with me like an uninvited guest. That night, the light over the sink was soft and forgiving. Rain had started up, gentle and steady, drumming a small, private rhythm on the back door. The kettle steamed on the stove, and I stood there, letting the warm hum of the kitchen fill me like a blanket. I was thinking about the photograph on the fridge, Emily at 12 with a gap-toothed grin and flour on her nose, and how quickly lives can speed from that to this high-definition, always-on adulthood. I was thinking about my husband, our rhythms, the quiet that had crept in not out of distance, but out of comfortable sameness, and about how many evenings slipped by without anything worth noting. That's when the door opened. He stepped in like a breeze that knows the rooms already. Brandon, he's Emily's boyfriend, a young man with an easy laugh and a careful way of moving. He's polite in the way that comes from being around people who are worth respecting. He removes his wet jacket slowly, like it might have memories clinging to it. He's not my type in the way of college sweethearts and prom dates. He's younger and brighter in the way young people usually are, but there's a steadiness about him that surprised me. I'd seen him at family dinners, the way he watched Emily, the way he listened. Tonight, though, there was a different thing in his eyes, something quieter, more serious. "Hi, Catherine," he said. He always uses my name, with a little respect that makes me feel older and oddly seen. "Brandon," I answered, wiping my hands on a towel I must have held for longer than necessary. "We weren't expecting you tonight." "Emily gone out?" "She's at the rehearsal," he said. "She asked me to come by and pick up a script, but I thought I'd check on you first. The rain's coming down hard." He stepped closer to the counter, not too close, not too far. He noticed the kettle, reached out like he might help, then stopped himself. "You look like you were just about to make tea." I told him yes, and I offered him a cup. He accepted. He took the cup with both hands, and for a moment we stood on opposite sides of the island like two people who have been taught how to behave in a house where lines were learned early. There's a rhythm to families. You learn where to stand, where to speak, what jokes are safe. And then there's the intrusion of the new, which rearranges those rhythms without asking permission. We started with small things. He told me about Emily's rehearsal, a late-night run for a role she told me had finally given her goosebumps, and I told him about the soup I was making, an old recipe my mother taught me that never seems to taste the same when I'm not thinking of her. He smiled when I said my mother used too much thyme, like he enjoyed the domestic detail, the small human truth tucked into a memory. Somewhere between talking about thyme and the weather, the conversation slid into more honest territory. "You look tired," he said, blunt and gentle at once. "Do you sleep well?" It's a question I don't get asked much. Men my husband's age sometimes assume I sleep fine because their nights are uninterrupted or because it's easier that way. Younger folks, people like Brandon, ask questions that have less armor in them. He didn't mean it as pity. He meant it as connection. I told him the truth. Not always lately. Nights are where old worries rumble to life. Small regrets, big silences. The kind of things you tuck into your chest because they sound selfish when you say them out loud. He looked at me then, not in the way someone looks at an adult that needs advice, but like someone who wants to understand how a person got to where they are. It made me say things I hadn't planned to say, about feeling invisible at times, about missing the noise of a house full of teenagers, even though teenage chaos is exactly that, chaos. I told him that sometimes I start making a second pot of coffee in the afternoon and pretend I'll share it with someone. An idea, simple as it sounds, that makes me laugh and ache at once. He listened. He didn't shift the conversation to Emily or excuse himself with stories about his own day. He just listened. At some point he set his cup down and reached across the counter to turn the radio dial, bringing in the low, familiar crackle of an old jazz standard. My grandmother used to put on music like this when things felt too big for words, he said. We just sit. We sat then, in that warm domestic glow. The rain kept time on the back window, and the kitchen smelled of onions and lemon from the sink. We shared pieces of ourselves like quiet currency. The work that had taught him to be patient with other people, the moment he realized he loved Emily for who she was and not for any version he had hoped she'd be, the night he felt most afraid because he couldn't promise an answer to someone he loved. His candor surprised me. He didn't come in with bravado. He came in with a worn tenderness. There's a difference between a man who talks smoothly and a man who speaks with the weight of his own experience. Brandon was the latter. He spoke about his father, how he'd left home early, how that absence taught him the value of showing up, and about the way he feared repeating patterns he had seen. He told me with a vulnerability that made my throat tight that part of why he wanted to be with someone like Emily was that he wanted to learn how to be the kind of man who could stand steady. That line, stand steady, lodged itself in me. We have all wanted steadiness at some point, at 50 or at 25. It's not about being unexciting. It's about being capable of holding someone's smallness and their triumphs without feeling diminished. I had assumed, perhaps painfully, that a younger man like Brandon might be fleeting, easily distracted by the bright glare of the world. But he surprised me. He told me then, gently, that he admired how my daughter moved through life, but he also said he admired the woman her mother was, not the television version of a mother, but the woman in the kitchen who remembered stories about thyme and laughter. I don't know how to say this without sounding foolish, he admitted, voice low. But I learned a lot watching you. Not just about being polite or making people feel welcome, though you do that, but about how to apologize when you're wrong, how to keep promises you make to yourself. You taught Emily a lot without using lessons. She watched you. It's a strange joy to hear someone speak of you as I imagine your mother might have wanted to be spoken of. It's a strange ache, too, because you realize how much you hoped your small acts mattered, and they do, sometimes in ways you can't see. I felt something shift inside me, not a scandalous rush, but a tender, aching warmth. It was as if someone had pointed a lantern at a corner of my heart I'd kept in dark for years. For a frivolous moment, I thought of all the small things that had kept me invisible even to myself, the careful way I arranged the pillows, the habit of muttering little jokes, the way I saved my nicer clothes for improbable evenings. Brandon's words made me blush the way I used to when someone noticed my dress or my laugh. There was a pause then, an awareness of lines that existed between us. He's Emily's boyfriend, not mine. He's a young man with a life that runs toward someone else. I could feel the gravity of it pressed gently at my ribs. I thought of Emily arriving home later, cheeks flushed from rehearsal, needing the mother she'd always had. I thought of marriages and promises and the complicated web of loyalty that binds families in quiet knots. And yet we didn't retreat into propriety like frightened actors. We continued to talk because our conversation had become something simple and human, two people sharing pieces of themselves under the soft, steady hum of home. He reached out once to brush a stray hair from my forehead, a gesture entirely innocent and more intimate than words. I felt the heat of it like sunlight. For a moment I wondered if I dreamed it. "Thank you," he said very softly, "for being a place where someone can be messy and still come home." There it was, the admission that changed the shape of the evening. Not a confession of romantic intent, not a crossing of a boundary, but an acknowledgement that we had both been seen, and that seeing, when it is true and kind, can feel like an invitation to be different. When he left the kitchen that night, he didn't slam the door or make something dramatic of his exit. He put the cup in the sink, shrugged on his damp jacket, and left a small folded note on the counter, a practice he explained later as something his grandfather taught him. When you can't find the words, leave a note that you'll say in person when it feels right. The note said, in his careful handwriting, "Thank you for tonight, for the music, for the soup stories, for being real." I folded that paper and put it in my apron pocket because I wanted to remember the warmth of the moment. I told myself stories about gratitude and about how human connection sometimes arrives when you least expect it. I told myself, too, that a kitchen can hold more than the sum of its cabinets and counters. It can hold moments of recognition that change how we move forward. By the time I rinsed the cup and turned off the light, the rain had slowed to a hush. I sat at the small table with a dish towel in my lap and thought about what a stranger's words can do to a woman who has spent decades practicing restraint. I thought about how attraction is not always a tempest. Sometimes it's a quiet rearrangement of how you see yourself. The truth is, I didn't know what I felt exactly, only that I felt noticed, and for a woman who has watched children grow up and seen friendships fade and marriages settle into habitual rhythms, being noticed felt less like vanity and more like a small, essential kindness. I slept that night with a note in my pocket and a memory of a young man's steady eyes. I didn't leap into unforgivable choices or rash promises. I simply let myself sit with the feeling, the gentle recognition that life can still offer moments of surprise, and that those moments, handled with care and respect, can lead to growth rather than chaos. I don't tell you this to scandalize you. I tell you this because there are evenings when life hands you a mirror, and you can see, if you're brave enough to look, the person you still are under the dust. And sometimes a stranger's kindness helps you dust it off. When I tell you the rest of this story, I'll tell you about the choice I had to make, the one that didn't get decided that night, but began with a note on the counter and an honest conversation over chamomile. For now, imagine me at the sink, a folded paper in my pocket, the rain outside, and the low echo of a jazz standard in my bones. Imagine how small, brave things, like asking someone which city they're watching from, or saying thank you out loud, can change the shape of an ordinary evening into something quietly remarkable. If you liked this, tell me what you would have done in my shoes. Did you ever have a night where a simple conversation changed everything? I'll be reading your cities and your stories while we keep going. When you're ready, I'll tell you what happened next. The morning after Brandon's visit, the house felt different. It wasn't that the rain had left, or that the kitchen was any cleaner, or even that the day ahead promised anything extraordinary. It was that something inside me had shifted. A quiet, almost imperceptible awareness had settled like sunlight across my skin. I could still feel the warmth of his eyes, the softness in his voice, the careful weight of his words. And I realized how hungry I had been for connection, not just small talk, not just polite gestures, but a real unguarded conversation with someone who saw me without expectation. Emily wasn't home yet, and I found myself moving through the house differently, slower, more present. I lingered at the window, watching the world wake up. The neighbor's dog barked in the distance, a bird skidded across the wet grass, and the kettle hissed when I put it on for tea. I thought about Brandon and the way he had handled our interaction. Respectful, genuine, never crossing boundaries, yet somehow leaving a trace of intimacy that made my heart feel lighter and more aware. Later that afternoon, Emily texted me, saying rehearsal ran late, and she wouldn't be home until nearly 8. I sighed, a mix of relief and anticipation. There was something almost meditative about being alone in the house after that night. I could replay our conversation without interruption, notice the subtleties, the way he had tilted his head when he listened, the way he laughed softly at my stories, the way he seemed present without demanding anything in return. Then the doorbell rang. My heart jumped, because it wasn't typical for visitors in the middle of a weekday. I opened the door to find Brandon, drenched a bit from a fresh drizzle, holding a bag. He gave me a small, apologetic smile. "Hi, Catherine. Sorry to bother you again," he said, shrugging off his damp jacket. I realized I left some rehearsal notes here. I wanted to drop them off personally. "Of course," I said, stepping aside to let him in. "Come in. The rain seems determined today." The kitchen felt alive again, warm and familiar. I poured him a cup of tea, and we sat across from each other at the small table. There was no need for awkwardness. The previous evening had broken the ice in ways polite conversation never could. We talked casually at first, about rehearsal, Emily, and the weather. But soon, as if following the natural rhythm of people who had shared a moment of vulnerability, our conversation deepened again. "I keep thinking about last night," he admitted, eyes fixed on his cup. "About what I said. I hope it didn't come across the wrong way." I shook my head. "Not at all. You were honest, thoughtful. I appreciated it more than I can say." My words hung in the air, simple but weighted with meaning. He looked at me then, and for the first time, I noticed the quiet intensity behind his gaze. It wasn't a look of desire in the reckless sense, but something more profound: curiosity, respect, and an almost palpable care for the person in front of him. It made me feel seen, really seen, in a way that had been rare in the past few years. "I wanted to say more," he murmured, voice low and steady. "Not about Emily, but about life. About how important it is to have someone notice the small things. I think you understand that better than most." It was true. I did understand. Life at my age had taught me to notice, to cherish details, to recognize beauty in gestures small and large. Brandon's words resonated deeply because they mirrored my own philosophy, and hearing them from someone else, especially someone younger, was unexpected, almost thrilling in a subtle way. We spent the next hour sharing memories, insights, and reflections. He talked about his childhood, about lessons he learned from his family, about mistakes and growth. I shared stories of my own life, both triumphs and regrets, and found a quiet joy in the way he listened, offering empathy without judgment. There was laughter, too, gentle and easy, the kind that sneaks in and reminds you that connection doesn't always have to be dramatic to be meaningful. At one point, he reached across the table, placing his hand briefly over mine. The gesture was light, respectful, and entirely innocent, but it sent a ripple of warmth through me. We didn't speak immediately. We simply held that space, acknowledging the trust and care that had grown between us. "Thank you," he said softly, withdrawing his hand with a careful smile, "for letting me in, even just a little." "And thank you," I replied, voice steady despite the fluttering in my chest, "for being genuine, for making it easy to talk." There was a pause, filled with the hum of the kitchen and the quiet rhythm of rain tapping against the windows. In that moment, I understood something important. Intimacy doesn't always need to be physical or romantic. Sometimes it's the shared vulnerability, the ability to be truly seen, that leaves the most lasting impression. Eventually, Brandon stood, holding the bag of notes. He gave me a small, thoughtful smile. "I should go before Emily gets home," he said. "She'll think I'm overstepping if I linger too long." "I understand," I said, walking him to the door. "And thank you. Truly." He nodded, and for a brief moment we just looked at each other. Two people bound by honesty, respect, and a surprising emotional connection. Then he stepped outside, the rain still falling lightly, and disappeared down the driveway. I closed the door and leaned against it, taking a deep breath. The house felt quieter, yet fuller at the same time. Something intangible had shifted, a delicate awareness of life's unpredictable beauty. It was a reminder that meaningful connections can come from unexpected places and people, and that they don't always follow the paths we anticipate. Later that evening, when Emily returned, I greeted her with warmth and curiosity about her day. The conversation flowed easily, and for a moment, I realized I wasn't carrying secrets or unspoken tensions. I had been seen, understood, and respected, and that clarity allowed me to be fully present with my daughter. As I prepared dinner and set the table, I thought about Brandon's visit and the profound effect it had on me. Life at 47, with its routines and responsibilities, can sometimes dull the senses, but moments like this rekindle awareness, reminding us that emotional depth and human connection